The world preserved by divine providence. Discourse 2 of Discourses on Various Subjects, Volume 2, by John Leland. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6, quote, "Thou preservest them all," end quote. In my former discourse, some observations were made concerning the providence of God in general. It was shown by several arguments that there is a providence, or that this vast world and everything in it is under the constant care and superintendency of that most wise and benign and powerful being that created it. Let us now proceed to a more distinct consideration of this important subject. The providence of God may be regarded as exercised either in the preservation of the world or in the government of it, to which two main heads all the acts of divine providence are reducible. First, that which comes first to be considered is God's preservation of the world. In that admirable address that is made to God in the name of the Jewish Church, after celebrating him as the great creator of the universe in those noble expressions, quote, "Thou, even thou, art Lord alone. Thou hast made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their host, the earth, and all things that are therein," end quote. It is added, quote, "and thou preservest them all," end quote, where it is signified that the preserving this vast frame of nature, and all things that are therein, is owing to the same omnipotent being that created them. As by creating them he brought them into existence when they had none before, and endued them with such and such faculties and powers, so by his preserving them, we are to understand his upholding them in this existence, and in the use of those faculties and powers which he hath given them. We must not imagine that things, when once put into being, continue to exist independently of him that first created them, for an independent existence is not compatible with the nature or condition of creatures, which owe their existence wholly to the will and power of a superior cause. It is easily conceivable that the self-existent Jehovah, who existed necessarily from everlasting, must certainly exist to everlasting, by the intrinsic excellency of his own most perfect nature. But the case is otherwise as to contingent beings, who have the source and basis of their existence without them, as they did not exist originally and necessarily of themselves, but merely by the will of the Creator, who willed that they should exist, and they existed accordingly. So neither do they continue to exist of themselves, and by the mere force and virtue of their own nature, but by the powerful will of the supreme original cause that gave them being. It is true that machines which were contrived and formed by human art may subsist for a time independently of the man that formed them, nor is this to be wondered at, since the matter or substance out of which they were formed existed before, and did not owe its being to the artificer. But no consequence can be drawn from this to prove that, therefore, things which owe their very existence and substance entirely to the will and power of the first cause may afterwards continue to exist independently of the first cause. The works of men's hands may subsist at a distance from the hands which fashioned them, but the creatures can never exist in an absolute separation from God, who is always most intimately and essentially present with his own works, so that it may be said with the greatest propriety that, quote, "in him they have their being," end quote, as St. Paul expresseth it, Acts chapter 17, verse 28, or as he elsewhere speaks, quote, "by him," end quote, or as it might be rendered, quote, "in him all things consist," end quote, Colossians chapter 1, verse 17. That we may treat this subject more distinctly, we may consider this preservation of all things, which is an eminent act of divine providence, as extending, first, to the whole inanimate creation, secondly, to all things that have life in their different degrees, both to the inferior brute animals and to the higher orders of rational intellectual beings. First, God, by his constant powerful influence, upholdeth the inanimate creation, this huge material system, in all its parts. As at the first formation of it, he put things into a certain order, So it is by his power and wisdom that this order and constitution of things is maintained according to the first establishment. Not only the greater heavenly bodies are preserved in their appointed courses or stations, but with regard to the lesser bodies and particles of matter, the laws of motion and gravitation, to which, by the divine ordination, they are subject, continue the same that they were from the beginning, and produce the same effects in the same circumstances. Thus, all things in the material world proceed according to a settled rule or method. This we are apt to pass over, with a slight regard, as a thing of course, whereas it ought to engage our admiration and lead us to the acknowledgement of a constant superintending providence. To this it is owing that, quote, the sun, end quote, still serveth, quote, for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and stars for a light by night, end quote, Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 35, and that the orderly returns of seasons are maintained, so that, quote, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night do not cease, end quote, Genesis chapter 8, verse 22. It is God that, by his powerful influence, sustaineth this huge terrestrial globe which we inhabit, which, quote, hangeth upon nothing, end quote, as Job expresseth it, Job chapter 26, verse 7. By his power, and according to his settled order, it is that the earth still preserveth its fertility, that the minerals continue to be generated and ripened in its bowels, and that the vegetable kingdom flourisheth in all its glory. As God said at the first creation, quote, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, end quote, Genesis chapter 1, verse 11. So, by his providential concourse, and according to his appointment, the plants, the herbs, the trees, the flowers, in all their tribes, and the various kinds of grain, spring up from their several seeds, and gradually grow up into maturity. The species of them are still continued and kept distinct, and they uniformly preserve their several virtues, their distinct forms and appearances, and bring forth their several productions in the appointed seasons. When we thus behold the regular course of things in the world about us, we should raise our thoughts to God, to whose constant care and influence this is owing. If left to themselves without a presiding mind, we could have no security for their continuing in being, much less for their being maintained in their regular order. It is the power, wisdom, and influence of the first cause ever present with his own work, and leaving nothing to chance or caprice, that is the foundation of all our hopes. It is this that giveth us any security that the sun or moon shall continue to shine, that the stars shall maintain their courses or stations, that the air, the sea, the earth, and the things which are therein shall preserve their natures and proper situations, and produce the several effects, and answer the uses to which they were originally designed. Secondly, God preserveth the beings that have life and sense, with their several powers, capacities, and instincts. He upholdeth them by his providential concourse in that kind of life which, according to his own appointment, and the order settled by himself in the beginning, belongeth to them, and this holdeth good both of the inferior brute animals and the higher order of rational and intellectual beings. And to this, probably, the words of the text have a special reference. For what we render, quote, thou preservest them all, end quote, might be rendered, quote, thou quickenest them all, end quote, or, quote, maintainest them all in life, end quote. First, God preserveth and upholdeth the inferior brute animals in their several species, which, by a wonderful provision, are successively propagated according to established laws, and continue to be furnished in all ages with the same organs, powers, and appetites, and the same admirable instincts. By these they are enabled to exercise the various functions of the sensitive life, and are directed to what is most proper for their nourishment, their defense, and their pleasure. To his providence it is owing that even the several tribes of insects are preserved, and go through their orderly transmutations, and come forth in their proper seasons in numberless swarms, and in all the beauty of colours. To this it is to be ascribed that the ants continue in all ages to be the same provident and industrious tribe, and so dexterously manage the affairs of their little commonwealth, that the bees so artfully build their waxen cells, and make their honey, and maintain their well-ordered polity, that the silkworm undergoeth its several wonderful changes, is provided in its season with proper food, and spinneth so precious a thread out of its bowels, that the waters still bring forth abundantly after their kind, and the rivers, lakes, and seas continue to be plentifully stored with innumerable quantities of fishes in their various forms, from the huge whales to the smallest living creatures which inhabit the watery element, to which may be added the several species of birds, which with great agility wing the airy region. The hawk, is said to, fly by his wisdom. The eagle mounteth up at his command, and maketh her nest on high, from whence she seeketh her prey, and her eyes behold it afar off. Job chapter 39, verses 26, 27, and 29. The stork in the heaven knoweth her appointed times, and the turtle, the crane, and the swallow, and other birds of passage, observe the time of their coming, Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 7. And the several sorts of singing birds chant forth their melodious notes, and sing among the branches. To the care of his powerful providence it is to be ascribed that the several kinds of cattle are preserved, and provided with their proper sustenance, that the dogs retain their sagacity and wonderful instincts, and the horse his strength and swiftness, for the use and delight of mankind. Yea, to this it is owing that the wild beasts of the deserts are provided for, as it manifestly tended to the beauty and perfection of the animal creation, that there should be such creatures formed, and endued with extraordinary degrees of fierceness, strength, and courage, so there is the same reason for continuing that there was for creating them. Thus are the several species of brute animals maintained and kept distinct, and are provided for suitably to their respective natures and circumstances, and the individuals of each species preserve their several shapes and forms, organs and appetites, and when they go off, leave others to succeed them, so that the admirable scheme is still carried on. The continuing things in such an established course and order, which we behold without astonishment, because we are accustomed to it, exhibiteth a manifest proof of a wise and powerful providence constantly preserving and watching over the various kinds of sensitive beings. We may therefore on this occasion justly apply those words of Job, Ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee, who knoweth not in all these, that the hand of the Lord hath wrought this. Job chapter 12, verses 7, 8, and 9. But secondly, let us especially consider God's providence as exercised in the preservation of the higher orders of rational and intellectual beings. It is He that preserveth the angels in their several degrees. None of them have an independent existence. Strong and mighty as they are, they cannot uphold themselves in being merely by the force of their own excellent natures, but are maintained in that noble and sublime life which He hath given them, and to the use and exercise of their admirable faculties and powers, by the constant sustaining power and influence of the Almighty. But what we are most nearly concerned to consider is the care of divine providence in preserving man. This is what St. Paul signifieth when, in his excellent discourse to the Athenians, Acts chapter 17, he declareth that God, giveth to all, i.e. to all men, life and breath and all things, verse 25, and that, in Him we live and move and have our being, verse 28. In Him we exist or have our being, as He gave us our existence at first, and made us of such a particular order of beings, so by Him we are continued in existence, and in that kind of existence which belongeth to us as creatures of such a species. To His providence it is to be ascribed that one generation of men riseth up after another in the manner and according to the laws wisely established by Him in the beginning, that the curious structure of the human body is preserved and maintained in its proper form, and with all its admirable organs, and that the human soul continueth to retain its noble faculties. In God we not only exist or have our being, but in Him we live, As it was he that first established the wonderful vital union between soul and body in man, so it is by his care and influence that it subsisteth. To this it is owing that our food nourisheth and refresheth us, that the vital functions are carried on, and that we are enabled to exercise our several sensations. Justly, therefore, doth the psalmist call him, quote, the God of his life, end quote, Psalm 42, verse 8. And Job declareth that, quote, in his hand is the soul of every living thing, and the breath, end quote, or life, quote, of all mankind, end quote. Job chapter 12, verse 10. And again, quote, thou hast granted me life and favour, end quote, saith he, quote, and thy visitation hath preserved my spirit, end quote. Chapter 10, verse 12. And as it is in God that we exist and live, so it is in or by him that we move. It was he that originally gave us the power of motion, and organs admirably fitted for carrying it on, and it is through him that we are continued in the use and exercise of those organs, so that it may be justly said that we cannot move a foot or lift up a hand without him. And this holdeth equally with regard to the operations of our souls, as the motions of our bodies. As he hath endued our souls with the admirable faculties of understanding, will, memory, free agency, and hath implanted in us affections of various kinds, so by his providential concourse and support of our faculties, we apprehend, judge, reason, remember, and freely determine our own actions. It is he that upholdeth the powers which he gave us, and enableth us to exert those powers, and put them forth to action. And this he doeth not only when we do good, but when we employ our powers in acting wickedly. And yet this doth not derive the least stain or guilt upon God, or make him the author of our sins. The natural active power, and the use of it, which is in itself good, is from God. The abuse of it to sinful purposes is wholly owing to ourselves, and to the corruption of our wills. God sustaineth the sinner in being, and in the exercise of his natural powers, whilst he is committing the sinful action, but the obliquity of the action is wholly from the sinner himself. And indeed, on supposition that God hath created reasonable beings capable of acting freely, and of doing good and evil, it is proper that he should uphold them in being, and in the use and exercise of their natural powers, even whilst they do evil actions as well as good. For if he should withdraw his sustaining influence from them the moment they attempt to abuse their natural powers, this would be absolutely to hinder them to exercise their liberty, nor could they in that case be accounted free agents at all. As the God of nature, he ordinarily upholdeth or continueth them in being, and in the use of their natural powers, in what manner soever they act. And then afterwards, as the moral governor, he will call them to an account for their actions, and will reward or punish them accordingly. I shall conclude with some suitable reflections. First, when we consider the universal dependence of the whole creation upon God, what admiring thoughts should it cause us to entertain of God, and what diminishing thoughts of ourselves and all the created beings? Who would not adore the great Jehovah, whose everlasting existence is the solid basis and support of the existence of all other beings whatsoever? Should not we be even as nothing in our own eyes, whilst God is all in all? Let us with the profoundest veneration prostrate ourselves before his divine majesty, who is the great I Am, the fountain of being and perfection, and be ready to say, quote, worthy art thou to receive honour and glory and blessing, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created, end quote. And not only so, but thou preservest them all, thou upholdest them by thy most powerful word, and in and by thee all things consist. Secondly, we may hence see what a just propriety and dominion God hath in and over us, since it is he that both gave us our being and all our powers and faculties, and who upholdeth us in life, and in the use and exercise of those powers. These two, taken together, his creation and preservation of us, certainly give him the most full and absolute property in us, and in all our services, that can be conceived, a property and dominion infinitely exceeding what one creature can possibly have over another. He made us, and not we ourselves. He preserveth and sustaineth us in being, and not we ourselves. and therefore it is most fit and reasonable that we should live unto him and not unto ourselves, and that we should employ our powers and faculties according to his will, and for such purposes as he prescribeth. Nor can anything be more unjust than to turn the beings we derive from him to his dishonour, to use those bodily members he hath furnished us with, and which he continually upholdeth, as the instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, instead of using them as instruments of righteousness unto God, and to employ those reasoning, thinking powers, and that gift of speech which he hath bestowed upon us, to purposes quite different from those which he gave them to us for. This certainly involveth in it a very heinous guilt, and is a sacrilegious alienation of ourselves from his service, to whom we do of right belong. That is a heavy charge which Daniel bringeth against Belshazzar, quote, the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified, end quote. Daniel chapter 5, verse 23. Thirdly, another reflection that is proper to be made on this occasion is this, that since God preserveth us every moment, since we cannot move a limb, nor think a thought without him, he must needs be perfectly acquainted with all our thoughts, words, and actions, and all the events which befall us. Justly may every one of us say with the devout psalmist, quote, Lord, thou knowest my downsitting and mine uprising. Thou understandest my thoughts afar off. Thou compassest my path, and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. End quote. Psalm 139, verses 2, 3, and 4. God knoweth every the least good action we perform, and every good motion which ariseth in our hearts. Nor, on the other hand, can any of our most secret sins possibly escape his notice. For it is by his influence that we are upheld in being, even whilst we are committing those sins against him. Our being able to commit them, our being preserved in life whilst we do so, is a proof that he is present with us, and, consequently, that he must know whatsoever we are doing in every circumstance. Fourthly, how strange and inexcusable will our conduct be if we allow ourselves in an habitual neglect and forgetfulness of the deity. Shall we be unmindful of him, without whom we cannot subsist a moment, by whom we are constantly upheld in being and in the use of all our reasoning and active powers? And soon ought we to forget that we ourselves exist. And yet so it is, that a great part of mankind go on from day to day, without ever thinking of that God to whom they owe it that they are able to think, and without speaking of him who gave, and continueth to them, the faculty and use of speech. They act in too many instances as if there were no such being at all, though without him they could not be. Amazing perverseness! What a strange deprivation of a reasonable thinking mind doth this argue! Let us carefully guard against it, and often realize God to our minds, endeavoring to maintain a constant sense of our absolute dependence upon him, so as to stand in awe of his power, to be thankful to him for his great goodness, and to be desirous above all things of his favour. For how great must his power be, which constantly upholdeth this vast universal frame, and all the numberless orders of beings in it. What folly, therefore, would it be for such creatures as we are to dare to offend him and provoke his just displeasure? How easily could he destroy us in a moment and put an utter end to our existence? Or, if he doth not think fit to do so, as not being consistent with the designs of his most wise and righteous providence, he can continue and uphold us in being under those punishments and miseries we had brought upon ourselves by our disobedience. The last reflection I would make upon this subject is this, that since God continually preserveth us, he hath an undoubted right to govern us, and this leadeth to the other main work of divine providence, viz., the government of the world, which is what I propose next to consider.